Welcome to The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated to the art of conversation. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University here in beautiful Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. This show is the official radio presence of Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, a course that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic. That is, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer, back and forth, what is often called Socratic discussion. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice, holding twice weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their choosing. Our theme this semester is the good life in the Great Acceleration, and all of our content falls somewhere within this intentionally wide umbrella. Each week, we're talking about how to live good lives in this era of soaring economic growth, technological innovation, labor market uncertainty, political turbulence, climate change, mass extinction, and on and on. My guests today are Leo and Ella, a pair of student moderators who this week asked our class to weigh in on the matter of whether guns should be regulated. Leo and Ella, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you.
First of all, tell us a little bit about yourselves. Where are you from? What are you majoring in? What prompted your interest in gun regulation?
Hello, I'm Leo. I'm from Allentown, Pennsylvania. I'm a political science major, a freshman. And I guess my interest in gun regulation has come from being a student in the public school system for 12 years.
And unfortunately, the matter of guns has become relevant to students in public schools in recent years. Ella, what about you?
Hi, my name is Ella, and I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm a secondary ed history major, and my interest in gun regulation is due to gun violence in the U.S.
Well, it's great to have you both on the show. Of course, we already talked about this issue yesterday in our class, so this is well-trod ground for us. We're going to revisit some of the same questions and see if we can pull out some of the more interesting details. But first, maybe you could make the case for us. Why is gun violence a serious and urgent issue that warrants our interest and maybe our advocacy?
I did some research, and in January to May of 2024, there were about 18,600 people dying from gun-related injuries. A little over 5,000 of them were under 18, and 1,400 of those passed away. There were 330 school incidents, and in those there were 267 killed or injured because of that. And then there were also more than 488 mass shootings.
I have to agree with Ella. I was going to also bring up the topic of the sheer number of school shootings that have happened in the past 2 years alone, which have been over 600 in 2 years.
So school shootings, mass shootings, these sorts of major events that we see in the news headlines all the time, certainly sparking a lot of interest in the issue and motivating people to get involved in this sort of advocacy work. Why do you think this is happening? And what is the root cause of mass shootings, school shootings? Why is this going on? It didn't happen when I was a kid. I mean, I remember I was in high school in 1999 when the Columbine shooting occurred, and it was notable because it was just unthinkable. And since then, it has become commonplace, as you note. Do you have any thoughts on why?
I think a big reason as to why these events have been increasingly common, partially a mental health issue. I don't think we do enough in this country for people who are struggling with mental health issues, and also just irresponsibility. I think if people who did own guns were more responsible with keeping them in a safe and locked away, I don't think a lot of these events would be happening.
There's a lot of research that shows that school shootings come from kids who are taking their parents' guns and then people who suffer from mental illness.
So if you were to take a step, let's say you were in a position to correct this issue or to propose legislation to Congress or something like that, what is your preferred method of regulating guns or gun ownership, gun sales? What do you think is the best thing that we can do to try and address this problem?
Background checks. I think they need to be stricter. In the US, background checks are only required for gun sales conducted by licensed dealers, so federal law does not address gun sales by unlicensed sellers. Federal regulations expanded in 2024 to require more background checks nationwide, but the loophole in the law still remains, meaning that if you go and purchase from one of your friends, you don't have to get a background check.
And the other part of the loophole was for gun shows, correct?
Yes.
Do you have any idea why it would be legally required for you to get a background check when buying a gun at a store, but not from buying a gun from a friend or at a gun show?
I think there should be, in terms of the background checks, like when you go and sell your car, you take your license to the notary and you have to have somebody sign off saying that you're like a transfer of the title. I think it would be pretty easy to implement something along those lines for gun sales. Obviously, people are going to still get guns and just not register them and change the name on the title, but I think it could be a relevant way to mitigate some of this situation.
One of the videos you had us watch was taken from Vox, and they were talking about how background checks often fail to do their job. And so they had suggested instead using some kind of a licensing model, where you have to get a license up front that includes an extensive background check and things like that, but that then makes it easier for you to buy a gun once you have a license in place. Do you know why we haven't done that already, or do you think that's a promising possibility?
I think just a lot of the American people tend to be against stricter gun regulations. A lot of people are very pro Second Amendment, so I'm not sure it would be that kind of idea would be very supported by a lot of the American population.
It's in American culture to hunt. Ever since we've came to America, found the New World, we've always hunted with or without firearms. And so I think that it would just be very difficult to get a lot of support from people, especially if they're into gaming.
Certainly in our class, when we talked about it this week, there's a strong contingent of people who are opposed to any restrictions on gun sales or on gun ownership, who seem to dismiss the idea out of hand and just conclude that it can't possibly work. Did that surprise you at all in the course of the discussion?
Not at all.
I think for me personally, I did find it a bit surprising. I thought it would be a bit more of a mixed bag where there were some people who agreed that gun regulation should be more focused, and then other people would disagree with that statement. But I was surprised by the sheer number of people who were against gun regulation.
We are in central Pennsylvania, as you know, where hunting is a big thing, and a lot of people go hunting. A lot of people have guns for hunting. But one thing that I find interesting about that is that the Second Amendment, as you mentioned, doesn't have anything to do with hunting. It doesn't refer to hunting at all. And so while we may be inclined to talk about gun ownership or gun regulation in reference to hunting, that's not specifically part of the issue. Have you read the Second Amendment? I mean, do you have a sense of what its intent was or how it should be interpreted today?
I think the basis of what the Founding Fathers meant by implementing or adding the Second Amendment was to ensure that if the citizens ever needed to overthrow the government for some reason, they would have the means to do so because the government wasn't able to restrict their access to guns. I think that idea is a bit outdated because I think even if we all decided to somehow overthrow the government, they would just use military force, and there isn't really much that American citizens could do in that sense of how the Second Amendment was actually written to be used.
I mean, there have been a bunch of really interesting books written on this subject in the last 10 years or so, and I've read a number of them and I've been struck by how the actual wording of the Second Amendment is interesting. It's just one sentence, and I won't get it exactly right, but it's something like a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, which just grammatically speaking is a poor sentence. There's a lot of commas in there. It's unclear exactly what the clauses mean. But of course, very famously, some of these gun rights organizations, especially the National Rifle Association, have sort of clipped off this one phrase, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and just left it at that. That omits the first part of the sentence, which is really important, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. I mean, that provides the justification for the right. Because we're talking about a time in 18th century America when there were no police departments and there's no National Guard, there's no standing army. Citizens needed to have a musket at the house so that if there was some kind of a disturbance or a danger, they could grab it and go perform their mandatory militia service and help protect the community. In that sense, I personally think the Second Amendment needs to be revisited because its grounds for existing are no longer relevant in the 21st century. The Second Amendment, as I mentioned, says nothing about hunting, but it also says nothing at all about overthrowing the government. I think that's more of a kind of a right-wing 20th century legacy from people who suggest that citizens need to be armed to fight their own government if necessary. And I don't see that in the text of the Constitution. And frankly, I think it's kind of a strange position to take.
I actually hadn't read the exact words of the Second Amendment and the way that you explain it. I do have to agree with you that that's not really the way in which it was written. I don't think it's a necessarily wrong interpretation because the Founding Fathers were worried about the central government becoming too strong. But I do think that the idea that it was more for literal protection in case something was going wrong in the community because there weren't police involved is probably a more accurate assessment.
I thought it was interesting that in the course of our conversation yesterday, the Second Amendment didn't come up at all, and we were just talking about really the practicality or impracticality of regulating gun sales. And that larger frame, which is so central to the discussion of gun rights and gun regulation nationally, just never really came up. And I was kind of sorry for that because I wanted to interrogate it a little bit and see what people had to say about it. But generally speaking, I would say my frustration with this issue is that there are certain claims that are just kind of allowed to skate, to exist. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. You can't regulate guns because people who want to get guns will get them somehow. There's really nothing that can be done. There are so many issues where, all you have to do is point out the problem and then people will say, all right, let's figure this out. Let's solve it. But on this one, the futility of it all, that people just accept, there's just nothing that we can do, is striking and kind of disconcerting to me. What about, we talked a little bit about the number of guns in the United States. Do you know how many guns there are in the U.S.?
I saw a number earlier. It said over 60 million, but I'm not sure if that's correct.
Quite a bit more than that, in fact. I was just doing some research here before you guys arrived today. And according to the Small Arms Survey, which records the number of guns owned by civilians globally, the United States is number one in the world in terms of civilian-held firearms. There are 393 million guns in the United States as of 2017. And that figure now is quite outdated. This report that I got this from is published in 2018. So as of 2017, almost 400 million guns in a country of about 330 million people. That means, according to the report, there are about 120.5 guns per 100 residents in the United States. So we've got more guns in this country than people. So perhaps it shouldn't be terribly surprising that we have a lot more gun violence in our country than some others. We also heard in the class, and this I think is interesting, from Gallup, that as of 2020, about 32% of US adults said that they personally own a gun. And so we live in a country where about a third of the people say they own a gun, but there are more guns than people, right? Which certainly suggests that a minority portion of the population is just stockpiling weapons. They've got lots and lots of them. And that probably contributes to the discussion as well. I was curious about this too. I started looking into rates of homicide, because one way that we might think about this issue relative to the class theme of the Great Acceleration is that much like the population and the gross national product and the carbon emissions, the number of guns has been growing exponentially in the United States. And so I was curious, is the rate of homicides, for example, growing exponentially as well? According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the rate of homicides in the United States is actually down somewhat since it was, 30 years ago. In fact, according to the Pew Research Center, the rate of homicides in the United States as of 2023 was 5.6 per 100,000, which is pretty comparable to where it was in 1968 at 5.2 per 100,000. The numbers went up in the early 1990s, then they were down through about 2014. They went up pretty sharply during the COVID crisis, and they have been coming back down again since 2021. I don't quite know what to make of that. It doesn't seem to be the case that having lots more guns in the country has translated cleanly to having lots more homicides. You know what I mean? What do you make of these rates?
Well, according to the Gun Violence Archives, mass shootings decreased 24% from 2023, and I think that this is directly because Congress prohibited the sales, transfer, and possession of semi-automatic assault weapons and large-capacity ammunition feeding devices in Act H.R. 698.
I'm curious too. I don't know this for sure. I know in the mid-90s, the rates of murder were quite a bit higher than they had been. And so the government passed, famously, an assault weapons ban that held for a while but was not renewed as of 2004. Now, when I look at the charts here, I don't see any clean relationship between that legislation and the rates of murder or homicide. Perhaps it just means that these things are kind of complicated. It's not necessarily like a clean input-output sort of situation. When people argue that placing any sort of restriction on gun sales or gun ownership is a violation of the Second Amendment, how do you respond to that sort of criticism?
I think that the way that I would defend that standpoint is that we already do place regulations on guns. Like Ellis said, there has been legislation that has limited certain types of gun sales, and we do already require background checks, at least in certain circumstances of gun sales. I think the big idea that they're usually getting at is that there shouldn't be more regulation because there's already enough, but the fact that there is any regulation is technically an infringement on the Second Amendment already.
If we could have a constitutional convention that was tasked with revisiting the Bill of Rights and altering this amendment, would you be supportive of that or no?
I think the wording of the Second Amendment definitely needs to be updated in terms of what is relevant in the 21st century as compared to when the Constitution was written.
Yeah, because back then they didn't have the weapons that we have now that are available for citizens to acquire.
Thomas Jefferson is supposed to have said that the Constitution should be rewritten every 20 years so that the living are not made subject to the tyranny of the dead. But that idea doesn't seem to have weathered very well. In our own day and age, there seems to be this strong commitment to originalism, to the text as written in the 18th century and what it was supposed to have meant. And that doesn't give us a ton of agency to update it or to reinterpret it or to try to make it more applicable to the times in which we live. You had asked us in the class yesterday whether the felt need to own a gun offsets the danger posed by mass shooters. In other words, should we run the risk of being victims of mass shootings in order to protect the right of private citizens to have a gun in the house for their own purposes? And for most of the class, it seemed like the answer was yes. The right to buy and own a gun is important enough to justify us running the risk of mass shootings. I get the sense that that's not the position that you take. How would you state your position on the matter?
I think there is valid concern of robbery or something going wrong that you may need a gun in your possession to protect yourself because the police wouldn't be able to get there fast enough to help. I think that is a valid concern in current age America, but I don't think that certain types of guns that are typically used in mass shooting situations need to be owned by average day American citizens. Like, if you want to have your rifle to go hunting, and if you want to have, your hand pistol locked up by your bed in case somebody happens to break into your house, that's an okay thing to do if that's what you want to do. But I don't think anybody needs to own a semi-automatic assault weapon to use as protection.
There was a study that from 2015 to 2022, mass shootings where an assault weapon was used resulted in nearly 6 times as many people shot, twice as many people killed, and 23 times the amount of people wounded.
I think it's also relevant to bring up the statistics behind if a gun is present in a situation, there's a much higher risk of gun violence. Guns are usually used in a impulsive way rather than when an actual threat of violence is occurring. If there's a gun there in the situation to begin with, they're much more likely to be used.
Yeah, if two people get into a heated argument and it escalates from there, the odds of somebody getting shot are much higher if there's a gun in the situation. That seems pretty straightforward. I was struck yesterday by how many people invoked the need for self-defense as a justification for owning or concealing and carrying a gun. And to me, it's especially remarkable in a place like central Pennsylvania, a place like Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, where it doesn't seem to me like our town, our county, our region are so dangerous that we all have to be packing heat like the Wild West. You know what I mean? And I brought that up as an example, and I mean, knock on wood, I've made it through my life to this point without feeling like I had to carry a gun for my own protection. And it hasn't really been an issue. So it always kind of perplexes me when people who live and move in the same, areas, neighborhoods that I do, seem to feel so threatened that they need to protect themselves in this way. What was your reaction?
If people wanted to carry in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania, I think that's based a lot on experiences that they've had before and not directly here at Bloomsburg. I understand why they would want to have a gun present, why they would feel safer.
I think there's also a big fear that we typically get from consuming media. The thought of gun violence, because we see it in the media, like a couple days ago on Instagram, when certain types of videos were shown of people getting killed. I think the fact that we consume that type of media inherently gives us a fear of violence, even if we don't live in a place where that has occurred.
When you got to the end of the discussion, as kind of your closing thought, you asked the class, if you don't support stricter gun regulations, like background checks or licensing or gun locks or something, then what's the alternative? What should we do instead? And I don't think there was much of a response. People were just kind of like, there's just nothing that you can do. But one of the most common responses to that sort of a question, in my observation, is that we need not fewer guns, but more guns, and everyone should carry guns. In fact, somebody did say, if everybody had a gun, then criminals wouldn't dare try to rob anybody because they know they'd be in danger. But to me, in part because I guess I'm a little cynical on this question. I always recall that the National Rifle Association, the Gun Owners of America, these lobbying groups don't just represent gun owners, they represent gun manufacturers. If the ubiquity of guns in American life has created a problem of safety, then it's very convenient for them that the solution to the problem is more of the same thing that created it. According to my reading here, there were about 50 million guns in the United States in 1950. And then by 2025, there are about 400 million guns in the United States. And that's not a flat figure, you know. There's more guns rolling off the assembly line right now, and they're going to sell those. And that number is going to continue probably to rise. If we point to that and say, you know what, this is a concern, and their response is, well, then let's make some more, I don't see the end game. Is it possible here that we could change our mindset, change our relationship toward firearms such that we actually think we need less of them and not more of them?
People say that the threat of going to prison or going to jail is a way to deter people from committing crimes, but people still commit crimes and they suffer the consequences or they happen to get away with it. But people are still committing crimes regardless of the fact that something bad's going to happen to them, even like if they do commit a crime. So I think the idea that, oh, you might get hurt if you try to rob somebody, or if you commit a crime, you might get physically hurt, isn't going to deter people from committing crimes because they already commit crimes when there's a punishment involved.
There was a study that showed that people who weren't allowed to purchase guns because of a violent misdemeanor offense were 22% less likely to be arrested for another violent offense compared to people who weren't denied.
As you look ahead to the next few decades of your own life, perhaps, having kids of your own, sending them off to school, are you optimistic that we can tackle this problem, or are you more worried about where it's headed in the future?
I would definitely say that I am worried about how this issue continues. I think certain rhetoric recently has been detrimental to any thought of ever creating any type of solution. I mean, our current Vice President J.D. Vance said that school shootings are just a fact of life, and basically just conceded that there is nothing that we can do when we haven't even tried.
I'm worried about it too. I think that there are steps we could take to lessen the problem and to get rid of people's worries, but I just think we haven't taken those steps yet, and I am hopeful that we will.
Leo and Ella, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
You have been listening to The Art of Conversation Radio, brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University. As always, I am your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you back here next time.